Hello there and welcome back to Beauty Bee, where today we are going to do another palettes that should exist. Today's victim is Tarte, specifically their Tartelette range. Now the Tartelette range has always interested me. I think it is a very classy looking range. I think it looks a little bit more expensive than a lot of Tarte's palettes do. The first Tartelette palette, the original Tartelette, came out in early 2015. It was an all matte, cool toned neutrals palette. And though I would have told you that Tarte has been kind of milking the idea ever since, at least in the core range, they really haven't. Yes, there are quite a few little offshoots from Tartelette that they've made, I don't even know how many of over the years, but there's really only 4 standard 12-pan Tartelette palettes. There's Tartelette, Tartelette in Bloom, Tartelette Toasted, and then Tartelette Juicy. And hopefully I put up pictures over here so I'm not just awkwardly leaning over during this piece. So what I've done today is come up with 3 mock-ups for palettes that I feel would help to flush out the Tartelette range a little bit while also fitting in. As you probably saw in the last set of pictures, the Tartelette range is quite neutral, and I wasn't going to go and build a rainbow palette to stick in it, or half neutral, half pops of neon. Instead, I've gone with 3 slightly more colorful palettes, what I would call a 2022 neutral. The makeup scene looks very different than it did back in 2015, and I think it's time for Tarte to expand. Not a lot, just a little bit. And then towards the end of the video, I will switch to voiceover and I'll show you how I make some of these mock-ups. Now, I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, and I do these in PowerPoint, but I thought it might be useful to some. So definitely stick around for that. If you're interested, I will try to put a timestamp, but if I don't, it's where things switch to a voiceover. Let's get into the palettes. I came up with a cover and then an interior for each, and we're going to work from my least favorite to my most favorite. So the first is Tartelette Blossom. This has a peach cover with some really pretty poppies on it. I think this fits the aesthetic of Tartelette. It's relatively minimal. I would say that there's more going on the cover of this than the other Tartelette palettes, but it's not going too far. And the colors on the front definitely reflect the interior, which I thought was important throughout this video. So when you open it up, you see a very warm toned looking palette. What is interesting, I think, about this, though, is that almost all of the color here comes from the mattes, which I think is a little bit different than sort of the standard. I feel like often when you see a half neutral, half colorful palette, the shimmers are the ones that really bring the color, and the mattes are just there to blend things out. I thought that this would be a little bit more of an interesting way to incorporate color into a Tartelette palette. You have some pink, you have some orange, you have some purple, all very warm toned, all very reflective of what is on the cover. But then additionally, you have these somewhat more neutral shimmers. I'd say that this orange, this really bold sweet tea type of shade, is probably the most colorful of the shimmers. The white, the pink, this cool toned gold, and the brown are all very neutral. And you could make a completely neutral look from this palette. That's true for all of the palettes that I put together. You wouldn't have to use any color if you didn't want to, but the option is always there. And I am not wild about these kinds of colors. This just isn't my wheelhouse, but I think it's pretty. I think it's very usable, and I think that it is an approachable take on color for someone who is mainly a neutral lover. And maybe this is a weird thing to say, but I feel like Tarte has this. I couldn't figure out after I made this why it seems so familiar. I went through Tarte's website and I couldn't find anything that looked exactly like this, but I can't shake the feeling that Tarte has this already. So if you know what it could be, what could be inspiring this little sense of deja vu for me, definitely let me know. I would be very curious because it's been bugging me for the last few days. With the next palette, we're transitioning to more of a gray and purple color scheme, and that's reflected on the packaging as we talked about earlier. This one I'm calling Tartelette Dusted, and it has this pretty, I don't remember if these are lavender or lilacs on the fronts. I think lilacs, but don't quote me on that. What's more important is what's inside, and this is a neutral take on a purple palette. I'm not quite sure how the beauty community as a whole came to this consensus that purples and pinks are somehow like half a step away from being neutrals, but I took that and ran with it with this palette. So technically this is a half neutral, half colorful palette, very similar to the last one. However, I think that this reads as a little bit more neutral than the previous one does. There is really only one row of true purples in here. It's that middle row. The top row is cool tone neutrals. The bottom row is grays on the left half, and then these very, very gray toned purples on the right half. So half purples, half nots. There's quite a bit of dustiness going on with this palette, hence Tartelette Dusted. And there's also quite a bit of depth. You could go very deep and very sultry for evening, or you could keep things really light. I mean, any of the shimmers in this palette I think would make beautiful one shadow looks, but you additionally have quite a range of mattes, both cool tone neutrals and purples, to play with if you wanted to build things out a little bit. I don't think there are any two colors in this palette that I couldn't see myself using together in an eye look, which I think is important, especially in a range like this. I mean, the Tarte range as a whole is not super catered, I think, towards someone like me. So someone who really likes makeup, who has a lot of it, who spends a lot of time working on it, thinking about it, etc. I think that the Tartelette range is geared a little bit more towards someone who's maybe not as familiar, who maybe has 2 or 3 eye palettes, doesn't necessarily do makeup every day, and even if they do, they probably keep it pretty similar day to day and maybe amp things up a little bit to go out. And for that person, I think that this palette is perfect, but it's additionally something that I could see myself using, which is the balance that I wanted to strike across all of these palettes. I am really tempted by this one. I think this is really pretty. I think I might try to build this with my singles. I don't know if I could quite do it, but it would be fun to play with for sure. And so would this last one. This last one is giving me a little bit of like Charlotte Tilbury vibes with the exterior packaging. I'm calling this one Tartelette Starry Night, and I decided to go with this sunburst design. I think it's really pretty. It's kind of giving me an Art Deco vibe, which I guess is also what Charlotte Tilbury is going for with the majority of her packaging. So I guess I understand where the Charlotte Tilbury vibes are coming from. So let's look at the inside of this palette. I wanted this to be like New Year's Eve in palette form, but one that you could also wear to the office. And that's kind of a tall order, but I think I did it. So on the leftmost column, we have very neutral toned neutrals. They're mattes. You could absolutely do a look consisting of just those 3 shades if you wanted to. On the right, you have a column of more cool tone neutrals. You have a cool toned, I I don't even know if this would be more of a taupe or more of a brown. I guess if I'm questioning it, it should be taupe, right? Because taupe is in between gray and brown. A gunmetal that is not a true metallic like the other shades in this palette. It's more of a satin shade, and then a matte black, because if it's a New Year's Eve palette, you know we need a matte black in here. And then the middle section of this palette is slightly cool toned, crazy shimmers, because I just, we're talking New Year's Eve. I want this to be super sparkly, super fun, like those honestly kind of awful sequined party dresses that only seem to come out around New Year's. I wanted these to look like those, and I think they're really pretty. I think, like the previous palettes, any of these shimmers could make a beautiful one shadow look. Some of them would be appropriate for the office. Some of them probably wouldn't be. I'm looking at this really like greenish pyrite shade in the bottom right. Can't see myself wearing that to the office, but it would be pretty on a night out. I think this palette offers a lot of versatility. You could make a very light look. You could make a very, very deep look, just focusing on that pyrite shade and the black. And there's a lot in between that you could do as well. I want this. I should probably make this one with my singles too, because I'm tempted, but there are my palettes. I hope that this was interesting. Now let's transition into the second half of this video with the making a mock-up.
So when going about making these mock-ups, especially if I am trying to make one that fits into a series of palettes, think like this video or the one where I made Too Faced chocolate bar palettes, I'll start with a picture of the palette itself. In general, you want a picture where you're looking straight ahead at the palette. That just makes it much easier to get the proportions correct. So what I do now is I just use the shape tool to trace out any relevant details. In particular, I'm going to start with the pans. Now, Tarte has shown this palette, which is the Leave Your Mark eyeshadow palette. Yeah, I don't remember this one either. As having the lid partially closed, so it's obscuring that top row of shadows a little bit. Now, reasonably, it would make sense that those shadows are probably the same size as the other square pans. So what I've done is I've just traced out the first square pan and then copied that and placed it where it needs to go. Additionally, I would strongly recommend for square pans not using the rectangle feature, but using this rounded rectangle. In a real palette, most of the pans are not going to have really perfect right angles, and I think that the rounded edges really does help to mimic that effect. Additionally, one thing I'm going to do here is take all of the pans and add an outline in gray or gold, depending on the palette. This mimics the pan that you can see from the front view, and I think really does add something and make it look a lot more like a real palette in the final result. Now, once I have the pans, I'm going to trace out any other relevant details. So here, this would be the two different levels of cardboard, and I'm going to pick colors for each of those. I spent a long time figuring out what colors I wanted, and it really didn't matter. Reading ahead a little bit, I've just gone and taken some screen clippings from actually ColourPop's website of some eyeshadows that I would like to stick in this palette. Turns out that I completely miscounted. There are 8 pans in here, not 9. Did I go to college for 10 years for math and statistics? Absolutely, but still don't know how to count apparently. Anyway, I am just going to cut these individual clippings and fill the pans that I've laid out with the shades that I want them to be filled with. using clippings of actual eyeshadows ensures that you'll get that texture, that it'll actually look like a powder in a way that just filling a solid color wouldn't. You aren't as limited as you might think to the shades that you can then get, because you can adjust these shades quite a bit within PowerPoint. I mean, you can brighten, you can add contrast, you can desaturate or saturate the colors, warm them up, cool them down. There really is quite a wide variety of different colors that you can get from a single picture. Now, not all of those varieties are going to look realistic or look good, but you have a lot of wiggle room even with the preset options within PowerPoint. Here I just went through and filled in the rest of the palette. I wasn't too worried about how this actually turned out. I usually find that there's quite an iterative process of filling in most of the palette, realizing a shade's not working, moving it out, trying something a little bit different, but here, just trying to show you how to build these. So I just filled them all in, and for me, this would usually be the end of it. However, I also wanted to show adding shade names. Shade names get really annoying really fast. I have found that generally word art rather than a text box is the way to go. You get a little bit more flexibility, but they are so annoying. So I just don't usually bother. So we have shade 1 and that's it.
And we're back to my face. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope that this one was interesting. If you enjoyed, I hope you'll consider liking and subscribing. I do like to do these palettes that should exist, or makeup fan fiction, as LS called it, videos every once in a while. I think they're really fun. And I would love to know what you thought of the 3 palettes that I showed at the beginning. And additionally, if you do choose to use some of the methods that I showed to pull together your own mock-ups, I would be really curious to see them. It's so much fun to pull these together, and I love to see what people come up with. Thanks again for watching, and I really hope that I'll see you all next time. Bye!